So because Mad Max Fury Road comes out in a couple of days, I wanted to talk about the first three in the series, so let's get this journey started. Mad Max is directed by George Miller, co-written by him and James McCausland, and stars Mel Gibson, Joanne Samuels, Steve Bisley, and Hugh Keays-Byrne. And Mad Max is set in this world where gangs are beginning to take over the roads and whatnot. And Max, played by Mel Gibson, is one of a few policemen left who are tasked with kind of just running these people down, trying to catch them. But as the danger begins to increase, as these gang members begin to threaten the lives of his family and his friends, maybe Max begins to lose it just a bit. And even before talking about this movie, I was so interested in how this movie was created. Like, this was George Miller's very first movie. He was an emergency room doctor. The funding that went into this movie was like $400,000, which is like nothing. And Mel Gibson, which was one of his first movies, like he auditioned for this with a beaten up face and whatever. I read all this in Wikipedia. But yeah, I really loved watching Mad Max. I think the world it creates is fantastic. I think Mel Gibson is great in the role, and I think George Miller directs this movie so well. And the movie's low budget really ended up working, I think, in my opinion, at the end of the day, because it gives the production design like this DIY punk feel almost. It really does feel like a world just beginning to slip into dystopia, and just people deserting the area because they're not there yet. I wouldn't call it a post-apocalyptic movie, like a full-fledged one, because there are still a lot of people still living in peace. But it's interesting to see this stage of dystopia and whatnot. And despite the low budget, I actually think the makeup and the costumes are still surprisingly very authentic. It really gives this movie something of like a horror movie feel at times, which I was very surprised by. And the musical score in this movie by Brian May can be very pulse-pounding in a lot of spots. It can also be very scary sometimes. It can also be very sad sometimes. It reminded me, of course, of some horror movies like I mentioned, but it also has shades in there of like Taxi Driver and A Clockwork Orange, and even like THX 1138, all these old really cool movies. And the sound definitely helps the already real stunts feel a lot more authentic and feel a lot more devastating and tangible. And yes, all the stunts here are practical. It's incredible to see. But what I really do love about Mad Max is that the world created by McCausland and Miller is just so engrossing, I think, especially in the dynamics between the members of the police force and the members of the gangs and whatnot. Not so much like how one group interacts with the other, but how individual members within one group interact with each other. It's a lot more complex than it seems. There's a lot of power play going on, and it really touches on the idea that maybe in a world like this, maybe becoming mad is inevitable, and we shouldn't just delay it or anything. We should just give into it, and I think it's super interesting. And I was happy to see that Max himself is actually a very well-defined character who is neither a hero nor an anti-hero at first. He really is just a guy with a job and a family, just trying to figure out what's best, for the welfare of the people he cares about. But make no mistake, the very core of this movie, it's really just like a straightforward kind of revenge story, but it really is given a lot of flavor by the world it sets up in the first half, as well as the numbness of tragedy that befalls Max. And I do think this movie is more of a requiem than a celebration, because there are some movies out there that treat revenge as a celebration, something you should be happy about, something you should cheer on. But the revenge in Mad Max comes off as something very tragic and sad. Mel Gibson is great in this movie. I think he adds surprising depth to Max by giving him real emotion, instead of just playing him as a stone cold cop. He doesn't come off as this huge action star in this movie, which I actually really like. The effect of having things taken away from him, I think, is greater because he plays Max as this, fully fleshed out human being with interests and fears and, a messed up mind eventually also. But I do think his chemistry also with Joanne Samuel, who plays his wife, is very good. She's very good also in the movie. Steve Bisley, who plays Max's partner in the movie, is definitely much more expressive between the two partners, and he's a blast to watch also. Roger Ward plays their police, chief guy, and he has a lot of good scenes as well. Tim Burns plays this younger kid who's in the gang that Max is going after. And I like how he's kind of a coward despite being amongst these really kind of fearsome people. And then Hugh Keays-Byrne plays the main villain in this movie, Toe Cutter, who is just all over the top and he's super theatrical, but it works so well for this kind of movie. And the way George Miller directs this movie, I think, is just, it feels so ahead of its time in the sense that, you know, he really shoots these car chases and these stunts just with pure realism, and he films them just so close to the action, which is something that a lot of modern action movies in this day and age can't do. And it really, I think, takes a while to get used to the world, but I think George Miller eventually draws you in and really gets you invested in just like the strangeness of everything. It's just such an interesting, colorful place to be in. But what I really like is that there's a vulnerability to everything in this movie. You know, like both Max and Toe Cutter, they're not, you know, superheroes, super villains or whatever. This is not that kind of movie. You know, they're both just guys in vehicles who can drive really well, but you know, they're just as vulnerable as each other. I do have a couple of issues with the movie though. For one, I feel like some of the acting can come off as very hammy. In the sense that, you know, you can tell that they're acting, and moreover, you can tell that this was made in the late 70s, especially in the first half. Like, some people just kind of are a bit too over the top that it kind of shatters the illusion a bit. But my bigger problem with the movie really is the fact that the entire first half and kind of the rest of the movie is somewhat messily edited by Tony Patterson and Cliff Hayes. I think that, you know, I really had a hard time watching the first half because I wasn't really sure what was happening. Some of the accents kind of, you know, confused me for a while. And again, you might say that this is all style, that it's really how the story should be told, but I found it kind of confusing, but it does get better after the halfway mark, although it's still kind of strange, like there's some really weird transitions and whatnot. But in the end, I still would say that Mad Max is a great movie. A lot of people will view it as like just a prologue to The Road Warrior, but I really do think it can stand on its own as, you know, this kind of revenge story, and I really think it's worth watching for that. Alright, so those are my thoughts on Mad Max. Have you guys seen it? What do you think about it? Did you love it? Did you hate it? Whatever you thought, whether you agree with me or not, please leave me a comment. Let's have a conversation.